The title of this and the conceit of this talk, my dear respondent, Dr. Andy Mycott will respond to this shortly, but I wanted to begin it by saying this is not simply an opportunity to get my cock out. It's also a chance to reflect on questions that have been motivating me and my research over the last 20 odd years, which is before I came to Manchester University, but when I was working in Manchester, and actually sometime before that. And these are questions which I'll need to be able to move the slides forward. There we go. Here are some of the questions that I want to think about, and I have been thinking about for some time, that are sort of hopefully wrapped up within this lecture. And they're concerning what makes a place cultural and what places need to provide opportunities for people to participate in arts, culture and heritage, why some places have more culture and cultural amenities than others, and how public policy supports, arts and culture, particularly in a highly centralised country and spatially unequal country, England. So my work has been looking at how decisions that cultural policymakers make impact on kind of the ways that people have access to arts and culture, the ways that they can participate in cultural expression in their place, which cultural expression is human right according to UNESCO. And so I want to think about how we conceptualise arts and culture, its relationship with place and its relationship with policy, and also think a bit about the kinds of empirical research and data that that's needed to make these opportunities more equitable. And so my plan is to take you on a bit of a journey, and I'm going to start with some theory. I'm an academic, so I think it's okay. But the journey is a kind of geographical journey. It's across the northwest of England via some key concepts. There's going to be a bit of death by PowerPoint charts. And hopefully we'll land on some kind of place of coherence. And as you probably understood, I'm a cultural policy studies scholar. That's my field. It's interdisciplinary field. I've done quite a lot of quite parochial work looking at the place that I'm in. And the place that we're in terms of cultural policy in England and the UK is highly instrumentalised, as many of the people in this room know from their own work, my dear peers and colleagues. We understand that UK cultural policy is instrumental in the way that it often attaches, in the way that Clive Gray talks about policy attachments to other sectoral interests. And this is really important when thinking about culture and place, because arts and culture and its investment is seen by policymakers as driving economic, social and political returns. Policymakers recognise that arts, culture and heritage have value and influence that's extrinsic, it's not intrinsic. They're interested in how culture can transform place. And I would say that this is a defining characteristic of the cultural policy here. It's inherent in all the structures and the kind of public policies that fund and govern culture, and it impacts on the funding decisions that are made and how these are evaluated, and the narratives of accountability that are required when distributing money from the public purse. So this is kind of what I want to talk about here today. But first of all, when I was doing a bit of a dummy run at the department last week or in the last couple of weeks, my head of department reminded me that I probably should try to define culture first. He is not a historian, so he can be forgiven. But yeah, quite often, and I've been involved in this, and again, has had many people in this room. I've been involved in developing local cultural strategies in previous roles, and often that's the first thing that people go is, what do you mean by culture? Here is a UNESCO definition of culture in the context of culture for development. And here you can see that there are two parts to this definition. There's a part where culture is sort of defined in that sectoral way. It's workers, it's artists, it's the professionals, it's the organisations, for-profit and not-for-profit. It's public cultural institutions. And then it's the kind of governs in between. It's the education, training institutions, the sorts of infrastructure, government agents, funders. So it's all of this stuff in a kind of systemic way, it's sort of formal. And then, of course, there's the other more anthropological sense that we understand culture, which is more around the values that we have, the identities we have, and the norms that we have in society, the way that culture is understood as a stock of intangible, renewable resources upon which people draw inspiration. And I think the second part is also really important, as Hope will find out as I'm talking. And these kinds of definitions are drawing on people like Raymond Williams, who many of you have heard of course, cultural studies, God, who kind of made a lot of these ways of understanding these kind of binaries or these different types of thinking about culture, part of the lifeblood of academics like me, where he talks about culture as being ordinary and as a way of life, but also as kind of ever changing. It's never still, it's never static. We have residual cultures, we have dominant cultures, we have emerging cultures in place. And we can see culture also as this sort of systemic series of symbolic goods. So, how we understand, arts and culture and creativity as this kind of systemic forms. And they might be professional, they might be amateur and so on. But then, of course, in policy terms, we have seen more frequently in this country, this idea of culture as a kind of merit good rather than a public good. It's this idea of it being an industry. Its job is to drive growth. Its job is to be economically valuable. And this is, there are some tensions between these kinds of definitions, some of which have been explored more recently by my colleague Justin O'Connor, and we've been doing some work with the Foundation Economy people, where we've been thinking about culture not as an industry, but as a form of infrastructure in its own right. And some of this work has also helped us to think about what culture is for, because if you're going to have cultural policy, you need to know what culture is for. And this definition here, this set of definitions, this three-part, not binary, comes from the work of Sen, way back in 1996, where he talked about the kind of constitutive, the evaluative, and the instrumental. And this is really useful because you can see how, culture is constitutive. It's enabling, it's essential to us, it's how we share values and traditions. It's how we speak the same language or speak a whole series of different languages that have commonality. And it requires capabilities in order that we can then have the full exercise of our citizenship. We can be flourishing human beings. It's also evaluative in that, through our participation, we take on different sorts of identities and values. We're able to make critical judgments. And we're not just kind of blandly consuming and choosing between products, but we are actively shaping our tastes and alignments when we're participating in culture. And then we get that kind of, in a third sense, the instrumental, which is where we're really thinking about, how, and there is a lot of evidence that culture does transform growth. It does transform places. It can, make you happier. It can make you sadder as well. And there are different ways that culture is seen as to have extrinsic value. The problem when you come to that with cultural policy is when there's only a focus on the outputs, that will dominate the purpose of arts and culture. And as Sen said, culture must appear not as a servant of ends, but as the social basis of those ends themselves. So I'm kind of thinking about this more social understanding of culture as foundational, as infrastructure in its own right, when I'm kind of thinking about its relationship with place. So, as I said, the title of the lecture refers to a conceit to take you on a journey. And here's the journey. The journey is from Macclesfield here, and then through. Yes, we have some Maxonians in the room. We go through the kind of fabulous metropolis, megalopolis that is now Manchester, and then to Maidenroyd, which is where I now live. Okay, and this is a sort of 20-year narrative arc that I'm using as a bit of a conceit. And this has taken me from a place that was defined when I first moved there for its lack of cultural amenities, through this trailblazing combined authority in the first evolved city region in England, and now to where I'm living, the neighbour to the very pretty town of Hebden Bridge. Can I hear the Hebden Bridge people in the room? Yeah. Where I am and my family, my husband, we live under Scout Rock. This is Scout Rock. And Scout Rock is a place that's been written about by local author Benjamin Myers in Under the Rock, where he kind of talks about its oppressive dominance. We are on the dark side of the valley. He describes the valley fever that you get from the lack of light. And we've just experienced that over the last winter. Ted Hughes also is from Mythenroyd, and he wrote also about the rock. And he described it as both the curtain and backdrop to existence. And he talked about Mythenroyd, the narrow valley with its flooring of cricket pitches, meadows, bowling greens, streets, railways and mills, how it seemed damp, dark and dissatisfied because the east-west traffic poured through it on a main route, converting our town to a mere corridor between places of real importance. Thanks, Ted. We'll get back to that in a moment. Anyway, let's start the journey. So here we are, Pratt Towns. This image is of a cushion store in Macclesfield that I used to walk past when I was commuting from Macclesfield up to the university, and actually before that up to the Arts Council, where I was working when I first moved to the Arts, moved to Mac. And it kind of defines the sort of sense of despair for me, in that this was the sole thing that was animating public space in the Market Square at that time. So I moved to Macclesfield in 2004, just before it was announced the cultural desert of Britain in its on declines. And I was working at the Arts Council as a regional research officer, and I felt like I'd not really earned that title because I hadn't really researched the place that I'd moved to, and I'd inadvertently moved to a cultural desert rather than moving to Taunton and Didsbury, which would have been expected at the time. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of crap towns. It was kind of popularised by the Idler, a sort of online and then in print journal. And they actually produced 3 volumes of crap towns over the years. And they were kind of like, you know, they were sort of defined as the worst of English mediocrity, inequality, you know, deprivation, planning, blight, and so on. But I was struck when I moved to Macclesfield as a research officer working for a regional arm's length body, how there was an anomaly between the title of Crap Town and a cultural desert, when there were clearly indications that it was a cultural place, not just the response in the local press, which is in kind of in the bubble on the left there, the right there, where you know, actually, you know, Macclesfield has a lot of kind of high level wealth indicators, but it found that it was a town without a cinema or major theatre at the time that was 400 times worse off than Westminster. And the then leader of the council said, well, actually, we have a wealth of poetry recitals, Morris dancing, brass band concerts, amateur dramatics, and similar one-off events, and so on. So, you know, there was kind of like concern in the town. We are cultural, but actually, there were also other acceptable indicators for it being a cultural place. It had, according to the metrics at the time, high levels of population participation in the arts. There were lots of creative businesses, games, photography, digital agencies, massive amounts of, in fact, the largest amount of heritage buildings that were listed in the whole of the Northwest at the time. And this had come from it being a silk town. So a lot of the buildings, a lot of infrastructure, the built environment of the town had come through non-conformist religion, people, you know, moving to the town. There's kind of civic institutions that you saw, a very early park, which I wrote about, which was bought and then through subscribed pennies from the poor and from the mill workers. So it had all this kind of like historic culture. It has great proximity to nature, the peaks, and also fantastic connectivity to Manchester, London, and the rest of the world. I know what you're saying. You're saying, why did you move, Abby? But what it did was it posed me a problem that I then wanted to look at. in my work, and I wrote about it back in not long after I joined the university, because I wanted to know why it was seen as this cultural desert, and whether it was why was there a lack of cultural infrastructure, formal cultural infrastructure. I knew from working at the Arts Council that it had very little arts funding at the time, and was it because people were supposed to travel elsewhere to get the culture, or were they supposed to just like stay at home? And was it that there was nothing to fund? Or was it a kind of category error? Actually, was counting the number of cultural assets in what was then a large rural borough the wrong way of looking at it? So yeah, it kind of got me motivated to think about these things, and I've been looking at them since. And one of the ways that you can look at them, or one of the ways that policy defines places as somehow in deficit, somehow crap, or cultural desert, is in terms of its participation indicators. As I said, Macclesfield ostensibly didn't have low levels of participation, but then in 2004, we didn't have the kind of instruments that we do now to measure arts participation. And this slide shows a little bit about how, how these kinds of instruments were just gearing up in 2004, 5, 6. And this, if you remember rightly, those of you who were around at the time, was kind of peak New Labour period in terms of cultural policy. So we had a New Labour government from 1997. We had the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. We had this kind of burgeoning discourse around what policy was for and how it could create, all of these kind of extrinsic valuable things. We had the Cap 10 report, which said that positive action for young people can, really, really help social cohesion, and all of these kinds of things that we're quite familiar with today in arts and cultural policy. And so in order to be able to look at whether or not these policies were working, the government needed to have the instruments to measure participation. And so these data are from what was recently called participation survey. It's now just changed to being the community and engagement survey. But when it started, it was taking part. But there's a problem, in a way, of asking people if they take part in the arts, and then if they're not, how you then formulate kind of who they are and what they're doing. So the question form of these kinds of surveys, as I tell my students about, that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow when I teach, are very important. And it's also informed other research that I've been involved in, the Understanding Everyday Participation project, where we try to get underneath the statistics to find out what is culturally valuable to people in their own lives. So if you say to somebody, do you take part in the arts, quite often if we know it's not for the likes of me. But through that very large research project, we found that all kinds of activities are in people's lives and they find them culturally valuable. And this quote is a long quote on the right-hand side from Mark Taylor's work on that project, was where he had looked at the kind of open field texts and other ways of understanding the data that you've got from this statistically significant survey of what people do. And he did his kind of statistical jiggery-pokery to establish that actually when we look at who is taking part in the arts, that are state supported, that public subsidy goes, then the statistic that he came up with is about 8.7% of people are highly active, but there's other people that are particularly well off, they're white and they're well educated. And then there's lots of other types of engagement that are going on amongst half the population in everyday participation. It's only really about 11% of people who might constitute what we understand as a sort of deficit. They're not taking part, they're non-users. And so doing this kind of analysis was really sort of, well, it was revolutionary in a way, although actually when you look at most cultural participation surveys in this country, it's still around the same proportions. So it's still the people who have access to cultural capital in a Bourdieusian sense, who are actually taking part. So So there's kind of issues with the way that places who have been defined. So this metric of low engagement has been used, this idea of cold spots has been used in arts policy to try to define where you should target funding. Because if people are not taking part in a particular place, then you should invest, and then they will have opportunities, and then you will do audience development, and then hopefully they will then benefit, and then the policy will be able to benefit, and then they'll be able to demonstrate through evidence back to Treasury that it's worth funding the arts, and because it comes up with all this extrinsic value, and that's the kind of cycle that we're on. So I thought this is a warning. This is where the death by PowerPoint comes. I thought it might be useful to look at actually how culture policy and arts funding works in this country. And sadly, because of the Teams thing, I can shut that down. There you go. So when I was preparing for this, I slightly guiltily asked AI if it could come up with a hand-drawn kind of diagram of arts funding. And I gave it some things. I said that there's these kind of things, but I was co-pilot. I have to say that beyond and it didn't do very well. It's not messy enough for a start, and there's like some really weird thrusts and yeah. So, but anyway, it shows you it gives you a sense of the different sorts of income mixes that arts organisations and cultural infrastructure have to compete to get in order to survive. And we're talking about, the funding for public good. We're talking about market failure funding, which is a common rationale that the market can't provide for things that we should have, and therefore we need to decide to put money into it from the public purse. But I think it's more like Mr. Messy than this particular diagram. So I thought I'd go through a couple of slides of data that is in the public realm. And this doesn't include all of the data that, because it's quite difficult to access it. But here is some of the kind of what we know about what arts funding looks like in England. One thing we know is that in terms of the whole of the public purse, for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, this is the amount of funding that was given in the last spending review. 0.36%. I'll just say that again, 0.36%. So quite a small amount is given to funding, to the DCMS to distribute. And then, of course, that goes into the granting aid bodies, and it also is given directly to the organisations, institutions that are funded through the government, through the national museums and so on, and also to national programmes for culture. But then we have also, you can see this is work from Eliza Easton and Salvatore De Novo, where they try to capture data and bring it together to look at the overall funding mix from public funds. So this doesn't include the fund apathy or the philanthropists or the earned income that arts organisations have. And what you can see with this slide is how much things have changed over the last 20 years. You may not be able to read the whole slide, but basically the big red block in the middle is local government expenditure on the arts, which is overall the largest money that goes into the arts for the whole of the country. And we'll come to that later, but you can see that a large amount of the decreases come from that particular source. Again, as many of you know, this is the kind of business model that arts organisations, cultural infrastructure depend on. Although actually, when I say business model, there are very many business models. But traditionally, it's this idea of a three-legged stool. So we have public funding, we have earned income, and we have private giving or contributed income from sponsorship, trust foundations, and other forms of kind of responsibility, sort of corporate responsibility, and so on. And there are loads of different types. This is from I think it's from Cause 4, this data, or from the Arts Council, where different sorts of levels of those three legs of the stool that go into funding arts and culture. Then we have, I mentioned grant and aid, so this is coming directly to DCMS funded cultural organisations. This is just to give you some idea of over time. And we can see how there has been these declines over time. Guess what years these are? COVID years, you see. And you can see the same peaks with, this is the funding that goes grant and aid to the arts councils and to Creative Scotland. So across the UK, very similar patterns. And this is over time and in comparison. So this one, a bit blurry, apologies for that, but really important. Data is from the Campaign for Arts from public domain, where they looked at what the spending review meant for the arts from last year. And this part of the slide shows how between 1998 and 2007, new Labour years, these are all the average annual growth for different, for the culture department, which is the red, and for overall spending in government. And you can see how it's all going up, government's very giving, very generous, giving to culture. And we can see 2010 to 2013, not all, that's the culture. And then this is like, our Cameron and Johnson years, where it goes up again during COVID. And this is where we are currently, which is kind of, I don't know, it's problematic, isn't it, really? Culture is the only department that has not seen annual growth. Yeah. And then over here we have a comparison across different countries in Europe. And this is the UK at the bottom. And we can see that it's gone down. Only Greece is at the bottom of the league, underneath the UK. Last chart I think, although I might hit with this more in a moment. This one here is just to show the complexity of arts funding. So these are all of the, I'm very proud I actually made this chart in Excel. And this is the different kinds of funds that come from the Arts Council that would use national lottery funding and the granting aid. So really, really complex, most of them targeting organisations and institutions, very little for artists, for the kind of root cause of creativity, something that in the recent Arts Council review, Margaret Hodge picked up on, something that has been discussed by artists quite a lot. And you can see these are just talking, these charts are showing how there has been a rise in national portfolio organisation, which is the more stable funding that arts organisations get over the last, between two different rounds. There's not much more to say other than more organisations want funding, and there's obviously not necessarily less, more funding around. The only other thing to say is that it kind of euphemistically calls people who apply to this fund but don't get it non-joiners. So that's a kind of just quick overview of what arts funding looks like in England. So I'm not talking about Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland because they have different systems. But I wanted to sort of, to kind of say the way that it's organised, and this is really important to our story about place, is that, as Andrew Pinnock said, funding is always political. So we have this system which was set up by John Maynard Keynes in 1946 and has been rolled out across the world of arts councils. The idea about arts councils are that they are preserving the sanctity of arts and culture from political abuse. Okay, so we have arm's length bodies, that's the arm's length. So it's really important. They should be decisions to be made and judged by experts, and government shouldn't intervene because culture is powerful and could be persuasive. We talk about in culture policy studies about propaganda and so on. These are the current government aims. They're mission-led. So under this government, DCMS's top 3 departmental objectives, well, only 3 departmental objectives, but they wrap a lot in. Growth and good jobs in every place. So we've got growth up there at the top. So creative industries, kickstarting investment. Richer lives with choices and opportunities for all. So we're getting this sense of, how culture, arts and culture do help you flourish as a human being and create further opportunities luckily, because there's an opportunity mission, so it needs to fold into the government's mission framework. And then a more socially cohesive country with an inclusive national story. Kind of interesting. How do you do place and culture in place? I mean, yes, you might want a more social cohesive, kind of communities working together, and culture might help to do that. I mean, look at the flags; they're doing a great job. So yeah, the inclusive national bit is where it jars for me there. So I just wanted to use that quote from Andrew Pinnock's excellent book on Funding the Arts about how it's not just as simple for funders. They're not just handing out money. They're intervening with complex economies, and this is something that we can really see in place. When you fund something, then it goes into a complicated system of things, and also you might not be funding others. You're redistributing public money on the basis of being elected representatives. You're doing it hopefully in a democratic way, and you need to do it in a way that's democratically accountable. But so that means that funders, even if they're arm's length, are political actors, even if they don't want to admit it. And I also like that he goes on to say cultural economists are also political actors, even if they don't want to admit it either. Even if they hold economics up as this kind of neutral, non-value judging way. Okay, so I said I was going to talk about the cheery topic of austerity. This is an image I've used a lot in various things over the years, because it's from Cheetham Park in North Manchester, where I did some work on the Understanding Everyday Participation project, and where this actually now grade 2 listed bandstand or shelter you couldn't get to it. It wasn't accessible. It wasn't part of the commons that I was arguing, and others were in the park. And this was in 2012, I think, or 2014. So really kind of at the height of austerity. As we saw from those other slides, in 2010, things changed. The Chancellor of Exchequer, George Osborne, came in and brought in two things. Amongst others, his great haircut, local government austerity, and also the kind of ramping up of English devolution. And we've heard a lot about, in this region, Northern Powerhouse and the gifts of the Northern Powerhouse. So looking at austerity and thinking about how local government, as was shown earlier, sort of actually overall the biggest funder of arts, culture and leisure services, and is democratically accountable to local representatives. At the time in 2010, there was lots of kind of infrastructure, lots of regional infrastructure, but then, the decline of local government funding on a non-discretionary sector has had huge impacts, as many of you know. And I told you there was another chart slide. These are just the kind of the curve of doom that you can see for local government expenditure. So we've got up there libraries, we've got local authority spending per capita in England, Scotland, and Wales. England is the lowest, by the way. Again, England and Scotland, this is Scottish per capita funding. England there, and then this is kind of overall culture and leisure services, all of the non-discretionary, the discretionary non-statutory services that local government support. So obviously this has been very difficult for local governments who act in partnership, support cultural organisations, run organisations, have a huge amount of cultural assets, buildings that they've historically have to navigate the kind of very complex, and I was just talking about arts funding, but very complex landscape of public funding, in order to try to ensure that the sustainability of cultural infrastructure, that they can keep these places open, that they can put on the programmes, they can put on the festivals, and that's really kind of pulled out the heart of. I talk about in the book about parks, about demunicipalisation. What these charts don't show is how unequal the picture is. between different local authorities. And that's partly because it's quite difficult to put the data together in a way that really shows the extent of it. But there are, we do know from other work more generally about how we are a deeply spatially unequal place in England. And that's the same for arts and funding and for cultural services. And that gets exacerbated because when you have less capacity, like Macclesfield, it's very difficult to then bid and compete. If you haven't got much funding, if you can't leverage one thing, and I'm working with Rochdale at the moment, and I just can't, the way that Rochdale operates in the way that, and I'm going to shame Pete now, but there's this really coherent kind of strategy for. It takes so much work. It's such, the opportunity cost for trying to put together and have strategic oversight at a local level to make sure that people can just access kind of basic cultural infrastructure. It's really sad, and it's these charts. And arm's length bodies can't intervene because they're arm's length, remember? So, they've been hidebound. They can't just simply backfill the funding gaps from political decisions at a local level. Instead, Arts Council are doing place work now. They weren't really doing it when I was just moving to Macclesfield, but there are priority places, there are place partnerships, there's creative people in places, there's ways of supporting these things. So I'm going to move on to another problematic image. Apologies. Racial inequalities and being left behind has got worse. I'm sure there are more recent statistics from a 2021 book by Martin et al. On levelling up left behind places. They look at a 30 or 40 year period, and they show how we've just become more and more unequal, and there are more places being left behind in England. And of course, we saw the levelling up for gender, where there were attempts to tackle this through national funding programmes that were partly post-COVID, partly post-Brexit, and partly about trying to kind of pump prime productivity, where economic output and productivity is deeply unequal across the country. And culture and heritage was a big part of that. We saw levelling up funds going into cultural infrastructure as a kind of way of tickling out some high street recovery, making things better again, and levering in productivity in some way. And we've got other similar kinds of funds at the national level, like we just had a 1.5 billion Arts Everywhere fund that was announced relatively recently, which is again about trying to backfill some of that capital investment and trying to make sure that places aren't possibly left behind. But as I observed from when I was recently on a placement with the DCMS as a policy fellow, the way that national funding frameworks see place is really, it's really difficult. It isn't place-based. It tends to be reliant on certain kinds of metrics. And I argue it's a kind of form of methodological nationalism in a certain way. Sorry. So last but not least, and you'll be glad to know that this is like, he's got a couple more slides to go before we hear what Andy has to say. Devolution. I said I was going to talk about devolution, and I've been thinking about it since working here over the last, sort of 10 years really, since we had Andy Burnham's elected, and it was 2016 was such a year. We had Brexit, we had the electoral mayor. I developed tinnitus in that year, and I think it was a result of one or the other. I'm not sure. So devolution, the passing down, the trying to decentralise this very centralised country, trying to move to place and think about that is something that obviously it's going to affect culture and culture in place, because we know that culture in place is dynamic, it's moving and so on. And when I've been thinking about this more recently, I came across some work by Kawashima, who was an academic I think she's back in Japan now, but she was at the Warwick Centre for Cultural Policy back in 1996, which is nodding and thinking maybe you remember this piece of work. And she wrote, in fact, I got it here. She wrote about decentralisation in cultural policy, planning for equality. She talks about how there are forms of decentralisation that are really important. So I'm thinking about this actually, really important to the research, and I've just come across this. In 1996, the same problems and the same ways of it. So this idea of cultural, fiscal and political decentralisation are really important. Cultural decentralisation is where you're not just going behind a national line, you're trying to diverse, you're doing cultural democracy in its truest sense, you're trying to find ways of decentralising the power of what culture is. It's not just a national story. Fiscal, proper distribution and redistribution of funding. So how do we do that in a way that it's fair so that every place gets the cultural infrastructure it deserves? And then political decentralisation. How do we make sure that this is democratic? How do we make sure that places can, and the people that live there, have a say? How do you decentralise right down to communities so that they have a community voice? And so I think, this kind of way of thinking about devolution is really important. And the obvious thing that it comes to is that you have to put place first. Again, working with the DCMS and thinking about how the very different way from national to local, and people I was talking with locally, how they were talking about place and understanding the needs of their place. You have to kind of put place and people first in their decision making. So I've just been thinking about more recently the idea that it's not about cultural placemaking that puts, the kind of culture as the instrument, but it's about place-based culture making that we need to think about. Anyway, devolution this is the positive bit. Devolution gives us ways of doing this. If we can find ways of coordinating across multiple levels of governance, we can find ways of, as we have done in Manchester, despite the, kind of rocketing up of the skyscrapers and the kind of interesting developments around Northern Powerhouse Gifts and so on. If we can find ways of, coordinating planning, so you're getting basic infrastructure there into people's place, and then bringing in cultural infrastructure because it is essential to people's lives. If you've got people who can, if you have a male precept and they can say we want a 1% culture, if you can tie together local authority and combined strategic authorities' interests so that, you have the right level of governance and you can work nationally and you can work locally too, then devolution is going to be, potentially a place for experimentation, a place for different models, a place for place-based working. And these are kind of some of the examples of the planning policy levers that are kind of coming through, partly through the English devolution bill, like tourism levies, business improvement districts, the community right to buy, really important. Oh yeah, this chart was just, I had to put this in because this is the one that's been in the news recently. Curious, nodding, which is the productivity in Greater Manchester. It's really working, look at this. But actually what they found is it's accountancy errors, it's to do with accounting, as Paul Sweeney wrote about it. It's actually that they've all been filed in Altrincham at the same time. So, yeah. Category errors, data, good quality data, really important. And we still have problems. This is some work from Bruce Tethers, work from a few years ago for the Creative PEC, where he looked at where cultural businesses are in Manchester and Greater Manchester, and you can see that there's still this so the reds are where there are low kind of levels of prosperity and low levels of creative businesses. The blues and the greens are the places where the creative businesses are, where we have higher levels of affluence. And as you can see, they kind of mirror each other. This isn't causal effect, but we can say something there about how creative businesses tend to go to Chorlton and Disbury and actually also to Macclesfield. So just on the edge. Okay, almost there. So I talked about, and I'm not really comparing, but I kind of am, because we've been there for a little while, Macclesfield and Maidenroyd. I think I'm only going to live in places beginning with M from now on. Melbourne, hopefully, at one point. And I just thought I was fiddling around with data and trying to think about how to show this. And I just thought, actually, Maidenroyd, the place of the rock, the place of cashews, the dark side of the valley. And then I thought, well, let me look at the data. And this is the per capita local government funding that goes into Colvett. So it's a larger area than Maidenroyd. And it's here above Manchester. Sorry, Dave. Cheshire East is down here. So actually a per capita funding, if we take that as a right measure, sort of isn't, because obviously there's fewer people in that local authority. But if, you know, so again, it raises the question about category areas and data and so on. But I was kind of surprised to see that, so I had to show you that there. But I just wanted to big up Maidenroyd a little bit and then think about why it might be good that I've moved there. So I just thought I'd do a quick Google. So this is just Google Maps, artist, not a great kind of, this isn't a very sophisticated piece of assets mapping. And it does show you, these were our next door neighbours at the Conus, by the way. It does show you that even in this, so here we have, and I mentioned about, you know, the corridors and the roads. So if you don't know it, in Hebden Bridge we have, and Maidenroyd, we have the canal, we have the river, we have the ridges, we have the railway, we have the roads. So all the infrastructure goes down the valley. And just mean it's really connected. I can commute into work quite easily. But it also means, you know, there's something about the place that artists have settled there. We know about Hebden as being the UK lesbian capital. We know about that as an indicator of its tolerance, which is Flora would be over the moon. But you know, other things have happened where there is a preponderance of community-led businesses. There's a lot of associational culture that's left over from when it was mills. We live in a house that was built by the Industrial Society of Maidenroyd, connected to the mills and the railway. So there's something about these places that has meant that artists have settled there, and, you know, some kind of tolerance and so on. Another little bit of mapping, as it's mapping, putting half bits, is what I do when I go to a new place. And it's also because I wanted to feature, it is on there somewhere, Barbary's, our favourite bar in Maidenroyd, and also the fact that there is a place called Hoo Hole. So yeah, so great beer in Maidenroyd as well. So basically, not so bad to have moved there. Why am I showing you this? I suppose it's just because I think I want to continue to think about crack towns and cultural deserts and places that ostensibly, you know, what places need. Think about those questions before, thinking about, how we can actually get arts everywhere. How do we support? What kind of data do we need? What sort of, you know, do we need to, does everybody need to do craft beer mapping? I like this. You know, what does that mean for cultural policy? And I think it's going back to that idea around decentralisation and place first and connectivity and coordination. So this is just my final slide, and you know, I'm aware that I have the cultural capital and the economic capital, thanks to promotion. To move around, you know, I can make these choices, and I did make this choice, and then we suffered over the last winter when it's been really dark and rainy. You know, I can go to places that have great infrastructure, sports pitches, community-run leisure centres, great park here, and so on. How can we make sure that, you know, everybody has that chance? Yeah, I just thought I'd show you, this is actually the rock. So it's like, for me. Thanks very much for listening. I did. Have I gone way over time?
Absolutely nailed on time. The only reason why Abby invited me is because she wanted to make a Dr. My Cock joke. I am possibly the gift to students that never stops giving, which I've turned into a comedy show. So if any of you listen to Radio 4 in April, I'm on Radio 4 doing a programme about the life of the unfortunately named. And I do a comedy show called Learning to Live with My Cock. It's not free for family, impossible. It's been a real pleasure to think about how I might start this. Often these professorial lectures, somebody's invited and they have to make some wonderfully intellectual response to what we've heard. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and tell a story, but I think the story of Abby herself as professor is one that's notable. Like myself, she had a non-traditional route into academia. She went in various different directions. She didn't go straight from the university through all the way. And that provides challenges because you're always in some sense catching up. Abby's not only caught up, but she's gone past many of those that took a more traditional route. I think you need to not only acknowledge that in itself as an achievement, but she did that both being a mother, a wife, and also being a woman. And in higher education today, we know that being a woman still matters in terms of promotion, in terms of getting on. It's still a barrier, which is remarkable to say in 2026. And I think before I start wittering on, I think there's just a simple acknowledgement of the personal achievements of becoming a professor and taking the route she did. Well done. And yeah, place and Abby's professional work is what I want to talk about. I want to tell a story rather than anything else. I grew up in Buxton, just over the hill from Macclesfield, and Macclesfield was a place we never went to. It was a cultural desert in some ways. As a teenager, unfortunately, and I can only apologise, the older version of me looks back with great shame at the misogyny of the Mac lads and its deeply unpleasant lyrics. But at the time, No Sheep Till Buxton was something that genuinely amused me. It was a pastiche of No Sleep Till Brooklyn by the Beastie Boys. Later on, I tried to claim coolness by acknowledging that is the front door of Ian Curtis's house in Macclesfield. I was listening to Joy Division in 1979. I was listening to Saxon and Iron Maiden, Def Leppard. But like many people, when you move to Manchester, you try and claim a cooler history than you actually have. But Macclesfield came back into my life through Abby and through the Barnaby Festival. This remarkable thing to move to a place, to develop an academic career, and also to give to the cultural development and richness of a place. And it's an incredible. I went in 2021, larger through my friend Simon Buckley, who's down the front here. He did a wonderful project where he went and lived in Mac Forest for a year, from the COVID regulations, but also presenting a wonderful piece in the local church in Macclesfield. And it's which point I first met him. I went, wow, oh, you're an academic, are you? Oh, you're an innovator. Oh, you're a curator. And all the other things that we mentioned already. And at which point I got to know her increasingly well. She kept turning up in my world. I work in a hybrid world where I'm an academic, but I'm also a public policy specialist. I work in policy engagement. It's an area of work which is growing across universities. And it is around the idea about how do universities translate research, how do they use their expertise of the staff that they have, and how do they try and enhance that sense of them feeling good. For people in this room, Laura, hello, who are also part of Manchester's great mission here. And it is something which has been fundamental. It's something which is becoming a significant part of a university's DNA and how it develops its engagement outside of its campus. And I think Abby's career has been something which proves that she's an applied educator. I often hear about her students, some of them are in this room, and how she encourages them to engage, to follow her, to learn and to develop their own practice. And her research and policy engagement, the fact that she was awarded hugely competitive UKRI policy fellowship with DCMS is an incredible feat in itself. The fact that she's already innovating to think about how she can take that experience and reflect it back to Greater Manchester, to Rochdale, to different parts of the world that we all live in, says much about how she is ahead of the game in many ways. But I think in many, what I'd like to think about is more how she's affected my own personal experience. She mentioned Crap Towns, fetid, awful series of books where people satirize poverty and inequality and dysfunction. There's 3 books of them. I'm a friend, Simon, and another friend of mine, Mark. We often go on trips to the places that other people don't think to go. We go and find beauty in those places, the crap towns, as they're called. And it's really instructive. This is a picture of, that's Mark's arm and leg there, on a train that goes around Scunthorpe Steelworks. And a few weeks ago, we jumped in the car and went on a tour around the Humber. And Abbey was looming in our mind as she was thinking about culture and place and belonging and community. And it was an interesting time to go because the future of Scunthorpe Steelworks is hugely precarious. And in itself, the scale of it is incredible. The fact that it has its own train journey. Do you know, rather than walk over,
I'll be a slide monkey.
you can be my slide monkey. That's so kind. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's incredible to think about this place and what it was and what it's becoming. We think about deindustrialization as something that blighted the 80s and 90s. It isn't. It continues to blight places today, reshaping the way in which they think about themselves, their sense of projection of their identity and their pride in place. And Scunthorpe is a place that's going to have one hell of a legacy. The steelworks covers a space of 15 miles. It is hugely polluted. The town remains blighted by its pollution. Health outcomes are considerably lower than the average in that part of the world. And this will take a generation to clean up when they finally decide at some point that the steelworks isn't a viable economic prospect. So once we'd been on our tour around Scunthorpe, we then went and had a walk around the town. And we know the narrative of these town centres that are dying. It is a consistent political theme that successive governments have come to. You mentioned them in your lecture about this idea of how you regenerate spaces. And you can see the public expression of it. That institutions are no longer respected. And that sense that politics and political parties of all hues have let them down is palpable. And when you walk around the centre of Scunthorpe, 2 things you pick up. The first is the classic example of deindustrialisation, the statue to the heritage of the things that used to bring people together, give them jobs, allow the local economy to thrive, to drive a sense of cultural economy. Gone. If you look at the study of where voted Brexit, often you'd find that the European Union would go into those places and it would regenerate town centres and do this. And the local people went, that's great, remind us of what we were. Why didn't you invest that money in regenerating our economies rather than our places alone? And in some senses, you saw that evidence in Scunthorpe. The wonderful Visual Arts 2021 Visual Arts Centre, funded by the Arts Council, inspiring arts in there. And yet, when you looked at the engagement of the people in there, to be honest, it was people like me, looking at abstract art. And when you thought about the engagement of it across the rest of the town, it really struggled. It couldn't take that weight on its own. And many of those that you described, beyond the 11%, I think was the figure you cited, that do engage with this kind of formal arts, well, they weren't there. So we walked around Scunthorpe and we found this place, Cafe Indie, community run, volunteers in its entirety, focused at young people, 18 to 30, trying to regenerate a sense of cultural capital, to bring young people together, to feel like they're not abandoned. It was a remarkable place, inspiring. I went in and asked them and said, where did you get your money? Did you get it from the local authority? They went, any more jokes you want to tell us? And when you look at the moment around the issues of devolution, one of the things that I've studied over 20 years is the politics of devolution, how devolution should work and how it is working. The theory is great, the practice is not. And the point that Abbey made about the DCMS and the way in which funding is pushed down, this national viewfinder it misses places like Scunthorpe, but when it does hit them, it hits them in a way that doesn't repair the damage of 15 years of austerity. It has blighted the capacity of the significant formal architecture to prop up places like Cathay and Lee. And yet it was inspiring. We had a great time in there. But then we moved on. We went to Goole. And Goole had the same. It had the same issues that the council couldn't invest in its local framework. It had, like in Scunthorpe, Scunthorpe has the Plowright Theatre, there's a theatre in Goole. But at the same time, the Junction Community Centre and Arts Centre also said that it lived in precariety. The local authority couldn't fund it. The new announcements of government funding are not streaming down to these places. The 6 combined authorities that have got the majority of the money that are coming through the new government programmes, well, they're Manchester, they're Liverpool, they're West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Greater Lincolnshire, Reform Mayor. It's not got the connection. These places have largely been missed out on this. And the thing that I noticed in Goole was that lack of pride, that lack of sense of connection. You know, who would go out and write that on a wall? And it was everywhere. And you saw it coming in different ways. This was a bus stop as I walked into it. Simon's driving along, stop the car, turn round. It's beautiful in its simplicity. Who needs to climb halfway up this lamppost and put a flag in? Who can effectively express that sense of disillusionment, of exclusion, of that sense of helplessness, voicelessness that often is very evident in these communities. And it's connected to this broader debate, well, around immigration and the idea of competition for resources. But I think the thing that we notice when we go to these places is there is considerable beauty, there is a considerable amount of community pride and interest. But often the channels of communication, of engagement, of participation are designed for people like me, the articulate, those that can express themselves verbally or by written word, who can understand the systems and can benefit from themselves. I worked at the University of Huddersfield for many years and knew Jo Cox when she was murdered. I chaired a democracy commission with the local council. And we thought that people would want to speak, and lots of them did, but they were the same people that spoke all the time. Huge parts of the communities that we're trying to engage in never engage with our work. And we never really thought about it until I met people like Abby, who got me to think about the power of art and culture and heritage, not only as an expression of pride, to give people a sense of connection to the place where they live in, to be able to go and do things and not have to travel 40 or 50 miles to go and watch a play, to go and watch a cinema, to go and see a band, but also to express that sense of identity, to be able to communicate and to become not voiceless, but empowered, and to project your voice through different forms of art and culture and heritage. It's interesting tonight, we've got 2 AHRC community innovation practitioners, Ruth Flanagan and Claire Tunnan. They are part of something which is a changing approach, in which Abby has been at the forefront, which is to use art as a form of expression and communication as well, to give people that might not get engaged the chance to shape and to influence the world they live in. And I think listening to your lecture, I thought that you got it right, that devolution is meaningless unless it's got expression and it has that ability to capture it. And I think this is a university that is benefiting from that. The fact that it's got a civic agreement that links across the universities, that allows that thought, that idea about, well, what is it that we can do as universities to connect better with our communities? We are bastions of privilege. We might not think it at times in the context of our own worlds, and it's a harder place to work in than when we all joined, or many of us did. But it is still something which is special. And I think that what I've heard in your message tonight is that this university and the GMCA and all the local authorities in the place where I live are doing a lot of work, but there's a lot more work to be done to make those communities and citizens feel part of the conversation in the different ways that you express. Because, well, we used to think that the coming storm was something that was an American coming storm. If you ever listen to the wonderful Gabriel Gatehouse series on BBC Radio, it projected another world. That world is here now, here in this country. And if we don't think hard about the kind of issues that Abby's raised, if we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, well, the signs of polarization that we're picking up, the signs of distrust in public institutions, not only in politics, but the system of government and the way in which our society is organised, well, it'll manifest in ways that we watch on the news and we think, can't happen here. Can. So I think in that, Abby, thank you very much. A wonderful lecture. And I think I should have my points. Thank you very much. That's a great photograph to have. I'm serious.
I'm just happy now.
I mean, I think there are times if anybody has any questions or anything they want to say, then I think we've got a little bit of time. I can see people need to, people leaving, yes.
Yeah, I was just saying it's interesting to see sort of marginalised communities and stuff, because I don't know whether you were the Elephant's Trail in Manchester, and it's a project that I'm now working with Trafford Council through them, looking at getting change within the council. And it's exactly, I'm very different to a lot of people in the group, been through homelessness, domestic violence, suicide, myself. So I've been through those things, but there are other people who've been through that much more marginalised. And it's the accents, it's the things like that, it's where they come from, which side of the tracks they're from. And it's seeing how those people suddenly getting a voice, changing them. Because there's other things through making every ever matter and the Unseen Voices panel. And hearing people who've been through the criminal justice system that were written off just simply because they made a mistake and they were from the wrong side of the tracks, they weren't worked with. And it's getting those little changes that are coming in Manchester, but it's getting those voices heard a little bit more, and it's trying to work with people like yourselves to say, can we get more interest? Can we get more contacts to have these people that have been through the system that are from there and had that? I mean, I went to University of Middlesbrough, and it's when they lost the cup, and walking through Middlesbrough, and it was dead. You looked in pubs and the doors were open and they were empty. And it was as if everyone had disappeared. It was like the Amiga Man, because it was just absolutely distraught. And you see how things matter to different communities of what it means, and it's getting that understanding, because you've got like people making decisions in London, and they don't have the same cultural values. They'll look at dance and go, what's that? But that means different people, and it's understanding those differences and having that in place and getting their voices up, and it's trying to get those through. It's organisers like ours are doing that and linking them and finding those opportunities to get more links. We started working, mentioned with the civil service, and it's slow, but it's trying to build up that process, those voices sort of get heard.
Thank you. That's a brilliant set of reflections, and I mean, just loads of things sparking. No, but I mean, I don't know if you know the work of Odd Arts and fantastic Legislative Theatre, which is it's not that kind of straight instrumental, or we'll inject some funding into culture and it will, kickstart the economy or whatever, or it will transform people's lives, or, it's long-term, rigorous work, giving people a voice, creating the circumstances for people to take risks and say what they want and challenge each other. And it's where you use theatre as a way of testing out ideas and experimenting. It's really powerful. And so, it's great to see that we have that organisation here in Manchester, and it's also how that might be useful for connecting up, like you say, all those institutions and people and communities that have let people down in the past. And you mentioned Middlesbrough as well. I mean, Middlesbrough, the devolution, even though, led by, right-wing mayor, it's amazing cultural managers in Middlesbrough, who are working really hard with their cultural institutions and their anchor institutions, to really and are committed to place. They're not going anywhere, and they have excellent skills, and they are working with communities at all levels. So, it's that. Thank you, Andy, for also reminding me that I had meant to say that. I think policy and research councils and universities and the third sector are working together to, there is a more place-based, place-first approach that is coming through. So yeah, I didn't want to end on necessarily. Yeah, no, thank you very much for your reflections.
Mr. for morale.
Still got over 10 minutes.
Are we okay? Yeah, are you all right? We're going to the pub afterwards. But yeah, so Claire and Kieran and Dave, and then back. So
yeah, it's more an observation really. Around the time of the Cracktown's publications, the New Economic Foundation published their Clone Town, New Town. I can't remember the exact title of it, and Hebden Bridge, I think, was the #1 new town, or where you don't allow chain shops.
yes.
So clone towns are where you find the same old shops and restaurants, etc. And new towns were more independent. And I think there's something to be said about people interested in creativity, design, but also that kind of independent, having the agency to independently express your kind of creativity and your culture and your entrepreneurialism. And I think that's why we're attracted to live in places like Chorlton and Hebden. And I'm going to big up Glossop because I live in Glossop.
Yeah.
We do, and off my own back with no funding, we're trying to drive and support our local creative community to play an active role in developing our cultural offer through loads of different DIY ways. And yeah, there's just something about that, like being given the space and the permission and that kind of sense of connectivity with your neighbours and to express your kind of creativity and culture.
It's what I would understand others do as cultural and social infrastructure, as being enabling, and without being a bit, kind of theoretically fat and reductive. It is that commons model, and that's what Frischman writes about. From an economic perspective, if you can create these opportunities, commons don't happen on their own. You have to participate in commons, but commons are enabling, and it's the participation that makes them enabling. But they also kind of need those rules. They need regulating. So the fact that Hebden said, no, we've only got a co-op, much to Bob's disappointment because he loves the Sainsbury's. We've got a co-op and we're not having any other kinds of, we're having, that is a form of regulation, isn't it? But it's about agreeing that participating in common to do that. And that's kind of what that's what thinking infrastructure is really important to my work at the moment, because and thinking of culture as being a form of infrastructure in its own right, aren't you? So thank you for that observation.
Yeah, I think you started to answer my question with the answers to the last two questions, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I'm academic. I was really taken with what you said, contrasting culture-based placemaking and place-based culture making. So rather than kind of making places safer for capitalism with culture, how do we do? What do we do to shift the the thinking of DCMS people in Manchester and London and Arts Council people and local authority people to the place-based culture making?
How long have you got? Yeah, no, I know. I'm funny enough. I just came across. I hit on that phrase today. I was just thinking, that's my conclusion. Actually, that's what I want to say, because the title of my UKI policy fellowship with DCMS was cultural placemaking, and I've always felt a bit uneasy about that. And actually, I'm supposed to be writing a book with Brian Humphreys about creative placemaking and kind of a critical approach to it. And we know about And so just making places good to be able to do extractive capitalism. That's kind of what, that's the skyscrapers and the inward investment and the form of economic development that we're used to seeing culture servicing. I think it is, but for me, what I want to be able to say back to national policy is it's not about setting up the competitive environments where you then ask people, or you select places, you target places for particular forms of investment. It's about how you support the processes that then enable that infrastructure to enable itself. Sorry, again, that feels really abstract, but the focus on outputs, input, output, and also targeting by I looked a lot at kind of data frameworks through which indicate, what kind of indicators funding would be eligible for. And of course, as soon as you start to say, well, there's this amount of percentage and this amount of percentage of people, places of low engagement, active people survey, bottom 20 decile, okay, we'll target those places. But then there's people around that, and it's how you define what low engagement, so there's real problems with only targeting and then hoping, and I've literally heard these words, oh, maybe we can just shift the dial in these places. And then what does that do? I was frankly furious when the Towns of Culture competition came out. And yeah, but just work around kind of, and that idea that, we can be even more extractive by encouraging people to bid for these things, because then it'll kind of start to happen. So how do we focus on joining up these different forms of infrastructure through public policy so that culture and social infrastructure is seen on the same level, and it's essential, and we thread it through planning, and we find economies, we find ways of supporting it. So you've just started me off on one. We'll be here all evening, but thank you. I'm sorry, Dave, I think you were.
Yeah, I've been trying to think how to frame this question, but I'm going to have a go, so bear with me. As you know, I've only recently become a gatekeeper. I haven't spent most of my life being a poacher. And I keep wondering whether actually cultural policy is a thing or even worth bothering about. And the reason I ask this is that as a poacher, I've had a 40-odd year career gaming the system. It sort of doesn't matter who's in government or whatever policy's there. What's mattered to me has been arts and community. I'm not alone on this. Lots of people work in the sector game the system in order to make it work for them. That's deeply unfair in many senses. It's not equal, because not everybody's got access to be in a position where they can game the system. And I just wonder whether the real issue is broader economic policy and approach to policy, and whether cultural strategy makes the slightest bit of difference. I'm probably working myself out of a job at accounting. You can see where I'm coming from. Yeah. Lots of my colleagues in my 40-year plus career in the arts have basically lived through gaming the system.
Yeah, tomorrow when we teach students on the MA in Arts Management about managing relationships, I'm doing the lecture on working with or for policy makers and funders. And in the seminar after that, we're going to be talking through my colleague Dr. Ryan Humphrey's paper about art managers as chameleons, having to, do all that shape shifting in order to suit all of those different requirements to demonstrate what good you're doing, whatever. And we also talk about in cultural policy studies around direct and indirect, or implicit and explicit forms of cultural policy. So in answer to your thing about, is cultural policy really a thing? As a professor of cultural policy, I have to say, yes, it is, because I think it's a kind of everything. But you're right, it isn't, let's just put it down to 0.336% and make it work really, really hard. Let's think about how it threads through all of these things, and so I think you're right. It's not making cultural policy economic policy. It's kind of realising that economic policy is also cultural policy. Oh, got there. Were you going to? Yeah, Thomas, thank you so much for introducing me and for me saying.
I would love to statement.
All right. My name.
I'm also trying to take this question, but I think gentle defence of cultural policy and I think about how organisations are kind of ready to navigate some of, I think what you mapped out. So I guess the question is like how ready is the sector that we have at the moment? So that those publicly funded organisations that you spoke about, ready to start to engage with the things that you're talking about, like infrastructure or working with communities, or and recognising that there are lots of different parts of that as well. But it just makes me think a little bit like if we think about creative partnerships, years ago, and you think about that was a massive policy decision, massive investment from government that still has impacts now to this day. We see lots of people with really excellent practice in arts education, and I think some of the work around placemaking and also kind of what we might call socially engaged or working in with communities kind of fits into that space. So yeah, how ready are organisations at the moment to kind of do that work, and are we ready for, I guess, creative partnerships 2.0, maybe with a kind of review to organisations doing that work? And if not, what should they do or develop to get to that space?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really hard question, isn't it? Because I shy away from talking about the sector because it's so fragmented and differentiated and also bloody exhausted. And so I don't think it's even readiness, is it? It's,
I'm ready.
So I should say there are definitely great organisations doing that work, but it's kind of it's really interesting because parts of it aren't ready, I think, as well, right?
I suppose thinking about policies that could help there, which is what they should be. They should be helpful, not regulatory or just kind of like punishing and exhausting. We could look at other more socially democratic cultural policies. We could look at Scandinavian countries. We could look at other places and other models and those people that were higher up the chart of doom that I showed earlier. I know that we're going to run out of time, and Pete wanted to say something. Ruth's ready, Pete, and then we should go to the pub.
Yeah, we probably should go because there's so much to unpack. So I think fantastic lecture. The question for me is ready for what and for whom? Because actually what we're driving, it seems, policy that's serving very few people, actually. And it generally is extractive in many places. Yes. And I think some of that thing, levelling up the slide, so that made me grimace a little bit. Because at the same time as you're throwing £25 million into a specific area, you've probably put £50 million out from the local government that is actually, as your other slide demonstrates, the biggest investor in culture. And I think that is a real interesting piece. Devolution offers so much more. We spent an inordinate amount of money on audience development strategies over the years. Professionals out there actually, we just sort out transport policy and allow people better access to infrastructure. That would probably make the difference. It's the
make their lives better.
Yeah, it's the unintended consequences. Yeah. So I often cite the fact that Margaret Thatcher is probably responsible for setting up more small arts organisations, and that wasn't what she intended with the social democracy, but she did. And Arts Council spent an inordinate amount of money on developing your creative practice. But to what end? And I think that the whole policy issue for me is really interesting. Cultural policy is important. It's how we sort of impact all of the other policies with getting people to recognise the true value of that.
Bitch, you get to the last one.
Okay, wow, that's it. Well, it's like a fun provocation. Let's see how tired you are or how quick you might come with that.
I'm really desperate to go to the loo just then.
Just thinking, 20 years ago, we were together in a remote country, somewhere in Asia, in the ladies' toilet, across, looking at the mirror. And for some reason, we started talking about cultural policy by mistake. I mean, you made that comment, the cultural policy by mistake. What do you think in terms of probably a successful example of a cultural policy by mistake, in terms of we're talking about unintended consequences of flawed frameworks that end up leading to positive, some achievements. In the context of what you have said, I don't know what you could think of as a cultural policy by mistake, and that it might even work and also result in
I think
something
in
valuable.
the interest of my bladder, I'm just going to cite Pete's example, you know, which is oft-cited as well, the community programme, the enterprise allowance scheme, you know, that was clearly an injection of capital into the places it needed to be to allow people to be entrepreneurial in a way that then, you know, and we're obviously seeing really interesting, deliberate policies on that front with the basic income for artists in Ireland just being made permanent, and other kind of models that I think, you know, like I'm really interested. We've got a conference in that I'm working with the Local Policy Innovation Partnerships, terrible name for a program project that I'm working on. We've got a conference in April where we're going to be thinking about some of these things and hearing from the Future Generation Acts guy from the Commissioner in Wales. And, you know, that model of cultural policy, very deliberate, not by mistake, not by accident, but where you go, well, actually, how do we future-proof for our future generations? I mean, I'm not sure, I want to know how it's working there, but it's just such a brilliant way of thinking, not rather than retrospectively, oh, what have we done? And then therefore we've got some evidence to show that we could do this again if we inject, give us some more money, we can inject it, we can do more stuff, we can do more stuff. This is saying, what do we need to take care of in the future? So I suppose, yeah, again, in the interest of my brother, to wrap up, I think that's why devolution is a potential opportunity, even when it causes all kinds of issues around where the democratic accountability lies. I've talked about it's potentially devolved responsibility from, you know, you just shifting the accountability around, but it offers this experimental space that maybe there will be some things that come out by mistake that we can then repeat. Thanks, everyone. We were going to go to Brewdog, to my shame. The school were going to pay. I got the school to 270 quid behind the bar. Guess what happened? It went into administration. It's gone. So if anyone wants to join me for a pint somewhere, we'll need to find somewhere. Yeah. Close probably this year.
There is. Must skill.
Where's that?